The thing about Nelson, that any engineer who worked with him loved working with him because he worked so hard. Despite the reputation as being the joker and the things he said about Mansell's family, he was a really hard grafter, wasn't he?
Yeah, so he never said anything like that about Nigel to me or when I was working with him. So yeah, he was great. And I do remember Nigel was absolutely adamant he was never driving the active car. Now, it was my invention. I developed it, and I did everything. In fact, I drove it when it first ran, because nobody else would drive it. I drove it in an airfield in Abingdon. And Nigel said no. He'd tested the Lotus active car, felt it wasn't the way to go, and it was too dangerous, and he wouldn't drive it. And so Nelson did all the development, and Schlesser did some too. And there was one occasion where Nigel was living in the Isle of Man, and Nelson had gone to visit his mum in Brasilia. And there was just something I really needed to test, and we booked Silverstone. And I asked, was it Sally then? I can't remember, but I asked if they'd, it's only a short test, could Nigel do it? No, couldn't do it. Couldn't come from the Isle of Man to Silverstone. So I rang Nelson, and he got on the next plane, flew back to England, did the test at Silverstone, and then went back to Brasilia. No problem. And then, once the active car won its first race, Nigel had to have one. Even though he said he would never drive one, the guys worked 24/7 to build a chassis, because the hydraulic tubes actually went inside the chassis. You couldn't convert one. And build a car, and then while they were finishing it off, I think, in the pits, I can't remember whether it was Donington or where, but they were in the garage, and Derek Warwick came wandering up, and there's Nigel leaning against the wall and said to Derek, "Oh, the bastards have let me have one at last." And the boys all chucked the mechanics all threw their tools on the floor and picked stuff out the back for a sandwich and a cup of tea. Yeah, he was not very popular with them for that sort of thing. Whereas Nelson was. In fact, when Nelson used to give the mechanics a little Christmas present, cash. And he used to give it to Alan Chalice, who used to distribute it amongst the guys working on Nelson's car. And when he found out that Nigel didn't, he gave them his mechanics one as well.
I remember Patrick saying Patrick saying to me one day, "If I could just get him hermetically sealed, drop him into the car at the start of the day and pluck him out of it at the end of it, that would be probably about ideal."
Well, I mean, to be honest, Nigel had the fastest car 5 times in his career, and he was world champion once. Here, now, if we're going to be controversial, and obviously that was, you look at that year where he didn't win the world championship, when the tyre burst at the last race in Adelaide. Okay, now that was obviously a tragedy, but the reason why it looks so terrible is because it was the last race, and we knew what all the points were. If you reverse the season, and he'd had a tyre burst at the first race of the season, by mid-season, pretty well everyone would have forgotten that he'd not scored any points at that race because his tyre had burst. And if the last race of the season, with him vying for the championship, had been Brazil, and he crashed on the first lap doing something stupid, which is actually what happened in Brazil, everyone says, silly old bugger doesn't deserve to be world champion. But in fact, it was the other way around. He lost just as many points in both events, but the perception of the unluckiness is due to the actual circumstance of the last race, not any of the others. It's like Nelson. He knocked all 4 wheels off his car whilst catching the leader at 3 seconds a lap in Detroit. He would have been world champion if he hadn't have done that. By the end of the season, sort of forgotten. You know what I mean? Yeah. Perception is often different to reality.